The rain pattered against the window, each drop resonating like a heartbeat in the silence of the room. The wind howled outside, the kind of wind that feels as though it's trying to pull you into the darkness. You're alone, curled up in bed, with only the soft glow of a nightlight to cast shadows on the walls. You've heard of bedtime stories that lull you to sleep, stories that calm the mind and fill your dreams with comfort. But not this one. This is no ordinary bedtime tale. This is a tale that waits for the storm, a story that lingers long after the last page is turned. Listen closely, because tonight, the story isn't just a story. Tonight, the story listens to you. The clock ticked softly on the wall, each second echoing louder than the last. The wind howled outside, rattling the window with a force that felt unnatural. You could feel it, the weight of something dark pressing in from all sides. It wasn't just a storm that was unsettling. It was a strange, creeping sensation that something was watching you. You had always been told stories as a child. Bedtime tales, fairy tales, ghost stories, even. But those were different. Those were things of make-believe. Your parents had promised that they would protect you from anything that could harm you, that no shadow could hurt you. But tonight, as you lay in bed, everything felt off. Something about the room, the air, the storm, it felt wrong. The wind picked up, sending the trees outside into a frenzy, their branches scraping against the side of the house like skeletal fingers searching for entry. And then, the sound of thunder, low, rumbling, like something deep in the earth was stirring. A storm was coming, a storm that carried more than just rain. It was carrying something else. You pulled the covers tighter around yourself, hoping for comfort, but the strange sensation only deepened. The thunder boomed louder, shaking the very foundations of the house, as if trying to warn you. It was then that you heard it. Whispers, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But they grew louder, clearer, until you could make out the words. It's time. Your heart skipped a beat. You glanced around the room. Nothing but the whispers. They were unmistakable. And then there was a soft thud, a noise coming from the corner of the room where your dresser sat. Slowly, your gaze moved to the shadow in the corner. It was faint at first, but with each flash of lightning, it seemed to grow darker, more solid. The shadow of something or someone lurking just out of sight. And then, just as quickly as it started, the whisper stopped. You held your breath, straining to hear anything. The storm outside raged on, its fury growing with each passing moment. But it wasn't the storm that terrified you anymore. It was the presence in the room, the quiet, the stillness that followed the storm's violent embrace. It was as if the world outside had fallen silent, save for the pounding of your heart in your chest. The power flickered, then went out completely, leaving you in complete darkness. The sound of rain hitting the roof grew louder, more insistent, as if the sky itself were trying to break through. You could feel the hair on your neck stand up. The air had grown cold, frigid even. You fumbled for the flashlight by your bedside, the beam casting long shadows on the walls. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see the outline of the door, the outline of your reflection in the mirror. But then you saw it. A figure stood behind you. For a moment, you couldn't move. The shadow was tall, slender, its face obscured by the darkness. But you could feel its eyes, even though you couldn't see them. Those cold, empty eyes, watching you, waiting for you. Tell me a story, a voice whispered from behind you. It was soft but demanding. Tell me a story or else. You froze. Your throat went dry. You had always hated those stories, the ones that seemed to follow you, the ones that refused to stay within the confines of the books they came from. But now, with the storm raging outside and the figure in the room with you, it felt as though the only way to survive the night was to tell the story. You hesitated, but the figure's presence grew stronger, pressing against you like a force of nature, suffocating and inescapable. A story now. You swallowed hard. your mind racing. The only thing that came to you, the only story you could remember, was one your grandmother used to tell you. It was a dark and stormy night. You began, your voice barely a whisper, just like tonight. The wind howled and the rain pounded against the windows. But inside, there was only silence, except for the sound of footsteps. The figure didn't move, but its presence seemed to grow, filling the room with an oppressive weight. You continued. An old man lived in a small cottage at the edge of a forest. People said he was strange, that he was a hermit who had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember. But no one knew the truth. No one knew what he kept hidden in the attic of his house. Until one night, when a young woman found herself lost in the woods. The storm came suddenly, and she sought shelter in the cottage. You paused, your breath catching in your throat. The figure was still there, still listening. Its silence was worse than anything it could have said. The woman knocked on the door. It creaked open, revealing the old man. He smiled at her, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was a twisted grin, like he had been waiting for her. "Come in, child," he said. "The storm will not last, but you will." You shivered as you recited the words your grandmother had taught you, not knowing why you felt so compelled to continue, but feeling as though you had no choice. The figure's eyes, those cold, empty eyes, watched every word you spoke, and you couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something you couldn't stop. The woman entered, and as the storm raged outside, she sat by the fire. The old man watched her, his gaze never leaving her. But then the woman heard it, a faint sound from above, the sound of something moving in the attic. The figure took a step closer, its form becoming clearer with each flash of lightning. You could now see the outline of its face, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. Its mouth moved, but no words came out. The silence was more chilling than any sound. The whispers came again, soft, like the rustle of dry leaves. But this time, you heard the words clearly. "Finish the story. Finish it or we will." The storm was far from over, and neither was the story. The room seemed to close in around you, the shadows thickening as you continued with the tale, though every word felt like it was being ripped from your very soul. The figure's presence loomed ever closer, its silence pressing on your chest like a weight too heavy to bear. The storm outside felt like a distant memory now. The thunder and rain no longer just part of the world outside, but an active part of this nightmare. Your voice trembled as you spoke. The woman heard the noise in the attic, faint at first. It was like something or someone was moving. She tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The house was silent except for that sound, scraping, shifting. She stood up and made her way to the attic door, her hand shaking as she reached for the rusty handle. You paused, breath hitching. The figure in the corner was now so close you could feel its presence like a cold draft, though it was still eerily silent. It hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but its hunger was palpable. It was waiting for you to finish. The woman knew she had to open the door. She was scared, terrified, but something inside her told her that the truth was behind that door. So she opened it. Your words were shaky now. You didn't know why you had to keep telling the story, why the figure needed you to, why it was pushing you forward. But you had no choice. Every second you hesitated. It grew stronger, the tension between you and the shadow more suffocating. There in the attic, she found a chest, old and worn. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, untouched for years. But there was something about it, something that drew her in, as though the chest had been waiting for her, too. She opened it with trembling hands. And inside, there was nothing. You stopped, feeling the weight of your own words settle in the room. The figure still didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but the darkness felt more oppressive, more alive. She stared into the chest, her heart racing. It was empty, empty, except for a strange old book. The cover was worn, its pages yellowed with age. And as she opened it, the first word she read sent a chill through her. Once you open this book, there is no turning back. The story becomes your own. The air grew colder. Your breath misted in front of you, even though you were still under the covers. The thunder rumbled louder now, echoing in the walls of the room, almost as if it was reacting to the tale you were weaving. And that's when you realized this was the story. This was what you were living. You didn't know whether it was your mind playing tricks or something far darker, but something was shifting in the room with you. The figure hadn't moved, at least not physically, but you could feel it, knew it had somehow crossed into your world, just like the woman had crossed into the attic. The woman couldn't stop herself. She began to read the book aloud, her voice trembling as she spoke the words on the pages. As soon as she finished the first sentence, the house shifted. The walls groaned, the ceiling cracked, and the wind outside howled louder, as if the storm had become part of the house itself. She looked around, but there was no escape. You felt the room shift, just like the woman in the story. The shadows lengthened, crawling across the walls, and your heart raced faster than you could control. It felt as though the figure had drawn closer, its breath cold on the back of your neck. It wasn't just watching you anymore. It was waiting. And the worst part, you knew exactly what came next. You couldn't stop yourself from saying it. She felt something watching her, something cold and dark, something that had been there long before her. And before she could turn to run, the attic door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The book, no, the story, had consumed her. The room was colder now. The darkness, so thick you could feel it on your skin. You hadn't even realized you had closed your eyes. But now, as you opened them again, the shadows seemed to have taken shape. The figure in the corner was no longer a vague outline. It was standing beside your bed, so close that its cold presence was overwhelming. Its form was taller than any person you'd ever known, thin and elongated, with long, spindly arms that reached out toward you, as though it wanted to grab you. Your breath came in short gasps, your body frozen under the weight of its gaze. You tried to move, to scream, but nothing came. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the room. The shadows grew, curling around the figure like dark, living tendrils. And then it spoke. You read the story, it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Now! You must finish it. You didn't want to, but you knew you had no choice. The figure's grip tightened, its presence now pressing in from all directions. Your mind raced as you tried to remember the rest of the story, the part your grandmother had left out, the part that had always been too dark to tell. But now it wasn't just a story. It was real. The woman felt herself drawn to the book again, her hand reaching for it as if controlled by an unseen force. She knew she had to finish the story, or else. She read the next line aloud. You will become part of the tale, a chapter that never ends. You shivered, the weight of those words settling deep in your bones. The figure in the room seemed to grow taller, more monstrous. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to devour the light in the room. You had to keep going. You had no choice. The woman's body froze. Her mind fought against the story, but the power of the words was too much. With every word she spoke, she felt herself changing, fading from existence. The story was consuming her, pulling her into its twisted narrative. Her voice grew weaker, but she kept reading, knowing that if she stopped, the darkness would swallow her whole. You felt the same pull. Your eyes couldn't leave the figure. It wasn't human, wasn't even entirely solid. It flickered like a bad signal on a television screen. Only the static was made of fear and hunger. The final line, the one your grandmother had whispered only once and never again. The woman's last breath left her lips, and her voice became part of the book. The story was no longer hers. It was the story of anyone who dared open the pages. The figure stepped forward, closer than it had ever been. You could feel the cold now, like icy fingers grazing your skin. And then it spoke one final time. You are now part of the tale, just like her. And when the storm ends, You will be the one waiting. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the figure vanished. The storm outside raged on, but the silence in the room was deafening. Your pulse raced. You were alone, weren't you? But were you really? The story wasn't finished. It was never finished. You opened your eyes, blinking against the dark. And then you saw it, the book. It was on the nightstand, its pages turning slowly, as though it had a life of its own. The first page was visible. The tale continues, and those who hear it will never leave. The storm outside had calmed, but the stillness inside your room felt more suffocating than the howling winds that had once torn at the house. The book on the nightstand beckoned, its pages turning on their own, as though someone, was writing the next chapter in real time. You tried to turn away, but your eyes kept returning to it, to the text that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The room was eerily quiet now, save for the faint sound of the pages turning, like the whisper of a ghost brushing past you. The shadows no longer seemed to cling to the corners of the room. They were moving, swirling around the book like a vortex, drawing you in with an invisible force. It was the same feeling you had when you first heard the whispers. Quiet at first, but now the voices seemed to call to you directly, to urge you closer to the nightmarish text. You felt the weight of the figure's words, still echoing in your mind. You are now part of the tale, just like her. The realization hit you like a blow to the chest. You weren't just telling the story. The story had been waiting for you. The figure, the shadows, the whispers, it had all been leading you here, to this moment. You reached out to the book, unable to resist its pull. The pages were old and brittle, but when you touched them they felt cold, as if the very ink had been frozen in place, waiting for you to disturb it. As your fingers brushed the next page, you felt a sharp pain in your chest, a sudden, searing heat that spread through your veins. Your heart pounded erratically, your breath coming in shallow gasps. You could feel the words on the page now, feel them seeping into your skin, crawling beneath it, like parasites burrowing their way into your very soul. And as you began to read the next line, you could hear the voice of the figure again, faint at first, but growing louder with each word. You will never leave this place. The words weren't just in the book. They were all around you, swirling in the air, wrapping themselves around your body like a vice. Panic surged through you. You tried to pull your hand back, but it was as though the book had glued itself to your skin. The ink began to bleed from the pages, the blackness creeping up your arm, as if the story itself was coming alive. You couldn't stop reading. You couldn't stop now, not when you knew, on some deep, instinctive level, that the story would never let you go. Suddenly, the room began to shift. The walls stretched and contorted, distorting in a way that defied reason. The air grew thick and heavy, as though you were drowning in it. You looked around, but the room you once knew was no longer there. You were standing in a place that seemed as though it was pulled straight from the pages of the story, a dark, endless forest, the kind where the trees are gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like hands, desperate to grab hold of you. The storm had followed you here, the thunder rumbling in the distance, but the storm felt alive. The rain didn't fall. It hung in the air, suspended in time. The wind howled through the trees, but no sound reached your ears. Everything was muffled, as if you had entered a different realm, one where time didn't exist. You tried to move, but your legs felt heavy, as though you were trudging through thick mud. The forest stretched out before you, and you could sense something in the darkness, something watching you from the shadows. The figure had brought you here. It had chosen you. The whispers came again, louder this time, filling your ears with their demands, their commands. They weren't voices you recognized. They were ancient, forgotten voices, as old as the forest itself. You must choose, they whispered. Choose, or become part of the story forever. You had no idea what they meant. There was no choice in this. Not really. You had already lost. The book had already consumed you. The story had already begun its descent into darkness. But then, through the fog of panic and dread, you remembered the woman in the attic, the one who had opened the book. She had been trapped, just like you. She had read herself into the story, and now it was your turn. But what if she hadn't just been trapped? What if there had been a way out? You thought about it for a moment, the words of the story swirling around you. The attic, the chest, the book, the end. It was all there, all waiting for you. If you could just finish the story, maybe, just maybe, you could escape. With trembling hands, you reached into your pocket, feeling around for the tiny flashlight that you had brought with you from your room. You flicked it on, casting a weak beam of light across the forest floor. The ground was covered in thick, wet leaves, and as you walked, your feet sank into the soft, damp earth. It was then that you saw it, a small wooden chest, half buried in the underbrush, the same one from the story, the same one from the attic. Your heart raced. The chest. It was the key. With shaky hands, you pulled it from the ground, dusting off the dirt and grime that had settled on it over the years, or maybe centuries. The lid creaked open as you forced it, and inside was the same book, the one you had been reading, the one that had brought you here. But something was different this time. The book in the chest was no longer blank. Its pages were filled with writing. Your writing. It was your own story, your own name written in ink, trapped between the lines. You had written yourself into the story, just as the woman had. The final chapter, your final words, were already there, waiting for you to read them. You lifted the book and began to read aloud, your voice trembling as you spoke the final line. And when the storm ends, the story begins again with a new chapter, a new victim, and a new tale to tell. The forest around you began to shudder, the trees groaning as if they were alive. The sky darkened and the thunder cracked, louder than ever before. The ground beneath your feet rumbled, and the shadows of the forest seemed to come alive, crawling toward you, as though eager to claim you. You felt the pull again, the pull of the story, the pull of the book. It wanted you. It wanted you to become part of it, to join the endless cycle of horror and despair. But then, just as the shadows closed in on you, you realized something. You had a choice, after all. The whispers had been right. You could choose. You could either accept your fate, become part of the story, and be trapped forever, or you could make your own ending. With a final breath, you slammed the book shut, its pages trembling in your hands. The storm raged, the darkness closing in, but you refused to give in. You were no longer a victim of the story. You had written your own ending. The forest screamed, the shadows recoiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the storm began to quiet. The book fell from your hands, the cover now empty, the pages blank. The forest was gone. The storm had passed. You were back in your room, the book lying open on the nightstand, just as it had been before. But something had changed. You could feel it. You were no longer alone. As you looked at the book one last time, you could hear it, the whispers, soft, insistent, like a call that would never be silenced. The story has not ended, and somewhere, deep in the shadows, something was waiting to write the next chapter.